Colgate for allowing me the honor to be the ambassador for Dr. White. It's truly been an honor getting to know Dr. White professionally and personally. It has truly been a pleasure. Like I told him at dinner earlier today, that I believe that nothing is by coincidence. Everything happens for a reason. And I hope that you'll be able to experience what I've been experiencing so far this day. A person who is who's down to earth, who is very knowledgeable, and very thoughtful. So I hope that comes across in the reflection of this evening. Dr. Micah White is the co-creator of the Occupy Wall Street protest, a movement that popularized the slogan, "We are the 99%, which aimed at the reduction of corporate influence on politics, closing the income gap, and student loan relief, all while working as the senior editor of the countercultural magazine, Adbusters. The Occupy Wall Street protest would start a movement that would eventually spread to 113 cities around the nation and 82 countries globally. Micah has 20-year record of innovative activism, including conceiving the debt forgiveness tactic used by the Rolling Jubilee organization, the RIP Medical Debt Organization, while popularizing the term clicktivism, which advocates the use of social media in organizing protests, and identifying the emerging trend of social movement warfare. He has been profiled by NPR's Morning Edition, The New Yorker, and The Guardian in recognition of his contributions. Esquire has named him one of the most influential thinkers of his generation. Micah has received numerous awards, including the Roddenberry Fellowship, the Voqal Fellowship, and the National Endowment for Humanities Hannah Arendt Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Bard College. Micah is the co-founder of Activist Graduate School, an online school taught by and for experienced activists, and is the author of the Canadian bestseller, The End of Protest, a new playbook for revolution. For those who are a part of the afternoon lecture, we'll let you know personally that we had a very good discussion. There's a lot to gain, a lot of knowledge to be had from that book. So if you haven't picked up your copy, please do so. We have some in the back. Without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Micah White.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone for coming, and to the organizers, to Mom for showing such a good time in Rochester, and GP and Stephanie and Tom. So, first of all, I think it's really wonderful to be speaking about social revolution and social change in a church. I think that there's going to be topics that we go into here in a church environment that I wouldn't normally be able to go into in the secular activist community, which is what I usually speak to. So that's kind of nice, and I want to be, let's use that to our advantage. Let's go into those areas that secular activists might not want to talk about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the talk into 3 sections, the past, the present, and the future. And then I want to leave kind of like enough time, ample time for questions from the audience. So oftentimes the questions are the most productive part of these experiences. But first, what I want to do is I want to take a moment and let's all just take a second and tune into ourselves and say, okay, what is the most oppressive thing about my experience? So what's the most oppressive thing about my experience as a woman, or as a retired person, or a young student, or whatever? Just take a second to tune into what that is. Okay, I hope that was enough time to think about it for your own personal experience. So I want to put this talk in the context of when we do activism, we are trying to change the things that we experience as oppressive. And those things differ from every single person, but really this is not an abstract discussion, even though it's going to be very theoretical, but it's grounded in the actual experience of, well, how do we end the oppression that we experience in our own lives? Okay, so So let's go into the past. So I started doing activism when I was 13 years old. My first campaign was to refuse to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, which is, the more activism I do, the more I realize that I unconsciously repeat things. So I was not the first person to do this, and I will not be the last person to do it. I just read about another person, I think in Texas, who refused to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, and now it's sparking some whole kerfuffle. So this is like one of the ways that in high school, I wasn't even in high school, that students in public school can like protest. That actually always gets their goat. They hate when you don't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. They really do. And that was my first experience. I think that what that taught me was that what happened is I refused to stand for the pledge, and then other students in the class were like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't stand. And it's not that they had any real reason not to stand. I mean, we're very young, but it's like they wanted to be part of that rebellious resistance. And I think that was my first taste of like, oh, you can like do rebellious behaviors that then get other people to replicate those behaviors. That's quite interesting. So every year from the age of 13 forward, I basically did more campaigns. So every year I did new campaigns. So, to give you a sense. And the important thing is they're always different. So the first one was not standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. I did like an underground newspaper. I was suspended from school. When I was 17, my family moved to Michigan, which ended up being a very conservative environment. And to show you how my thinking has changed, I started an atheist club, which sparked a whole bunch of national attention. I was on Bill Maher's politically correct. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about the experience. This was around Columbine, so there's a lot of attention around this question of, because the Columbine killers were atheists. And so it was about, don't persecute every atheist student, etc. So anyways, this was the second time that I experienced like, the capacity of activism to basically become something bigger than myself. So when I was 17, all of a sudden what I was doing was creating a conversation that was bigger than what I was. Did more and more and more and more in activism. Every year, more and more activism. And eventually, when I was 28, I had been to Palestine and done direct action on violence. And when I was 28, I found my way into this magazine called Adbusters. I actually started working on it when I was like 20 years ago. Basically, by the time I'm 28, I worked my way up to the closest collaborator of this magazine called Adbusters, which is a kind of anti-consumerist magazine based out of Canada. Okay, we're leading up to the story of Wall Street. So in 2011, if you remember correctly, the Arab Spring starts. So there's a fruit seller in Tunisia who sets himself on fire. All of a sudden, the protests then spread to Egypt, where people in Egypt start going into Tahrir Square, which is like this square right outside of their Stalin era, like Obama. It's like this building that has all of the administrative buildings, like offices in one place. And I had lived in Egypt for a little time, for about 9 months prior to this, so I was kind of familiar with what the situation was there. And then the impossible happened, at least from the Egyptian context, which is that Mubarak did step down. They actually did succeed in toppling this person who had been in power for like 20-something years, that everyone had thought this is impossible, this will never happen. And it opened up a global revolutionary movement. The protests spread to other Arab countries, but importantly also, they jumped into European countries. They jumped to Spain. And in Spain, in May of 2011, they started doing something very interesting. They started this movement called the Indignados. They started going into their squares, and they started holding these consensus-based general assemblies, where they got together, they debated the future of democracy and how they wanted to change their society. And it was very beautiful. If you look at the pictures of that time, it's like thousands and thousands of people hashing out like, real democracy, we want this. And so I was working at Adbusters, and we had been trying to spark some sort of social protest in America for that's like the whole reason the magazine exists. And so we're watching this, and I was talking to the founder of Adbusters on the phone, and I was saying, this is the revolutionary moment that we've been waiting for. Like, having lived in Egypt, this is like, I could see how fundamentally this shift was. And so what we did is we sent out an email to our network. It's as simple as that. We designed a poster and we sent out an email. And the email was like a tactical briefing. And what it told people is it said, look, basically there's called a shift in revolutionary strategy or tactics. We told people, if we can combine what's happening in Egypt, which is let's go to a place of symbolic importance, and if we combine that with what's happening in Spain, which is this idea of having these consensus-based assemblies, and if we could do that in America, in the place where we are most oppressed, which we argue was Wall Street, then we can kick off this revolutionary movement. And this is one of the things that we'll get into in this talk. What was most amazing, of course, is that it like worked. Not only did it work, within like 24 hours it worked. Like it was like instant uptick, you know? And people started very quickly organizing. So like basically within a week or two, people in New York got together and they started organizing for Occupy Wall Street. The core idea of Occupy Wall Street that we wrote to after the briefing is that this would be a leaderless protest, there would be no alpha males, there would be no leaders, and that the direction of the movement would be up to the participants themselves. But we told people, let's come up with our one demand. That became this kind of hovering question. What does Occupy want? And we were the first ones to ask that. We say, let's get into our squares and tell people what we want. Of course, that never happened. So I'm telling one version of this. So one version of the story is a very typical activist story. It's very, I wouldn't say necessarily ego-driven, but it's an agency-based conception of change, which is, I did these things in collaboration with this person, and this is what happened. But there's another version of it too, which is, that I kind of alluded to, which is that the whole world was in tumult, and they were waiting for something. They were waiting for that idea that would capture people's attention. And maybe it's possible that it was luck. That we were the ones who inserted the proper idea at the right moment. We'll talk about, I think there's some truth to that. So the factors that created Occupy Wall Street were this economic crisis and this feeling of losing our fear, and then this new tactic of hope. So what happened was, of course, that it was, for those who remember, for 2 months it was amazing. It was fantastic. It was unbelievable. At first, it was largely ignored. For the first 7 days, it was largely ignored. But then, some women got pepper sprayed by an overzealous NYPD officer, and then Jon Stewart started paying attention, started making fun of NYPD. Why are you pepper spraying these women? What are you doing? Then it died down a little bit. And then 700 occupiers got arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge, and it just exploded. It was the biggest mass arrest in, I used to say in American history, but I have been informed that actually in the 70s, a larger number of people were arrested during, okay, anyways, it was the largest mass arrest, nonviolent mass arrest in, 20 years. And that, boom, it just took flame. And it spread, and that's when it spread to all the different countries. It had been simmering in lots of countries, but that's when it was just like 82 countries. And what's amazing about that moment, and I think that this says a lot about the social phenomenon of social movements and what they mean for the future of change, is that the speed and growth of Occupy Wall Street in that moment, around mid-October, exceeded the capacity for human understanding. This is, I think, a really important part, is that old-style organizing, you'd have maybe a person or a team, they would call people, it was slowed down by the speed of communication. With Occupy, we let the idea out there, and it grew as fast as people could go, which was way faster than anyone could understand. So in mid-October, it's like, I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, either we're going to be in, every single city on Earth, or basically, if you extrapolate the speed of what was happening, it was like, we're going to colonize space next, because there's going to be no space. Of course, these growth curves just eventually end very suddenly, but you can't tell when or how that's going to happen. Okay, so then, of course, it didn't grow forever, and on the contrary, November 15th of 2011, Mayor Bloomberg carried out a paramilitary raid. He, at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, police helicopters above, riot police, everything, went in there, shut down the camp, kicked everyone out, destroyed all the things, and that was essentially the start of the decline of the movement. From that point forward, within the next 2 weeks after that, all of the encampments, about 80% of the encampments around the world were evicted in this exact same way. So another key lesson here. The status quo is slow to learn about a new tactic, but very quick in implementing the counter tactic. So as soon as they figured out how to defeat the occupying encampments, they just called each other up and were like, here's how you do it. And boom, we were all done. Occupy tried to reoccupy spaces, never successfully. And then finally by May of 2012, after a foolish and abortive general strike fizzled out, the movement was over. So, what did we learn from this experience? Of course, and now what I'm going to say, when I first started to talk about Occupy, and I'm talking about it as a constructive failure, a lot of people said, you can't talk about it as a constructive failure. It was a success. So let me just, yes, it was a success, okay? I'm not trying to be negative, but, so it was successful in certain ways. It was successful in the sense that we gave birth to a whole new generation of activists. All of the social protests that we've seen since 2011 are really the result of the opening up that we accomplished, leading to Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, like all of that stuff. If you compare the amount of social activism that's happened in the 7 years of Occupy with the 7 years before Occupy, it's quite obvious that something really changed. That we made activism cool again. So we trained a new generation of activists, we changed the discourse, we brought income inequality into the mainstream consciousness, okay, all of these great things. But we did not literally occupy Wall Street, and we did not literally end the power of money over our democracies, and we did not fundamentally change how power is structured, and we did not end income inequality. And in fact, 2018 is sadly remarkably similar to 2011. So it was a constructive failure. Constructive because it taught us something, or at least it should teach us something if we're paying attention. So what did it teach us? I think that activists now, those who want to learn from the experience of Occupy, are forced to reassess our methods. So now we're moving into the present. I think that activism is in the moment of having to rethink activism. In a way, we need to do activism against activism. Now, not every activist is going to do this, and you can see that in the years since Occupy, some activists have doubled down on even, I would call, even more regressive forms of activism. Like Occupy, from a sociological perspective, was rather sophisticated. We had encampments, we had gestures, we had all of these like behaviors. It was a rather sophisticated movement. If you compare that to, for example, and I hate to pick on them because I love young activists because I was one, the March for Our Lives, it's a relatively simplistic, I would say. When I said that I'm teaching a class at Bard, and I said this, and all the students like so obsessed. No, she said to me, this is actually really reveals the lack of learning that happens with generations. She said to me, no, we did something new. We did a walkout. I said to her, oh my gosh, if you Google high school protests, walkout is the first thing every high school student is. There's walkouts when I was in high school. I mean, like they literally do not know that. Which is one of the reasons why we are losing. There's a really strange, like, the opposition learns and internalizes all of the social protests that have happened up until now, whereas we just like repeat the same behavior that was. Anyways, so not every activist is reassessing their methods, but I think, having talked to, for example, I hosted an event with the co-creator of Black Lives Matter, I think she's also reassessing methods. Everyone's kind of, the ones who are very thoughtful are thinking about it. So I want to pause here for a second and just tell a little bit of a parable, which I think kind of captures the state of activism. Okay, so this is the parable of 3 pigeons. And the way it works is that there's 3 pigeons. Each pigeon is put into a box. Okay? In the box is a lever, and the lever releases food. This is the classic behavioral experiment. Okay, so the first pigeon, every time it hits the lever, it gets food. The second pigeon, every time it hits the lever twice, it gets food, so it gets it on the second hit. And the third pigeon, it gets food on random pecks on the lever. Okay? So what's interesting here is that once the pigeons learn the system, the scientist disconnects the lever. Okay? So what happens? This is a very interesting thing that happens. So the first pigeon hits the lever once, and is like, oh, this thing's broken. It just stops. It's like every time I've done this before, I've gotten food, I'm like done. The second pigeon like maybe does it three or four times. It's like, oh, this is obviously not working, and just like stops. But the third pigeon never stops pecking. Okay, so what does this mean from the perspective of activism? So the pigeon, this is a metaphor back. The pigeon is an activist. The lever is their way of protesting, and the food is the desired social change. Now, what's happening here is that the third pigeon has a false theory of change. The third pigeon has developed basically a broken theory of change. And so when that theory, so the first pigeon has an accurate theory of change. They peck the lever, they realize there's an association between the lever and food, and when it stops working, they try to change a new tactic. Similar with the second pigeon, even though they learn it more slowly. The third pigeon never understood that there was no connection between the lever and the food change. What I'm saying is that for a lot of activism, there is no connection between the behaviors that activists are doing and the change that they claim to be the result of their behaviors. And this has led to a very dangerous situation where we repeat the same behaviors without understanding there is no connection. This, I think, manifests most fully, I would argue, in movements that are cultural changes. So, like, for example, the biggest example, and we'll get into it later, but one of the biggest examples, the counterexamples people give me is, well, what about the gay rights movement? Because they'll say, look, the gay rights movement, people have gay marriage now, they didn't have it before. Surely this is an example of a successful activist movement. I think instead this is an example of a broader cultural shift that was accomplished through, all different forms, not necessarily just activism. And then activists have a tendency to claim credit for it. This is one of the things we'll have to think about is I think we're very unsophisticated in our thinking of change. The larger point here, though, is that we do need to be attuned to the possibility that there is no connection between our protest behaviors and the change we see happening in the world, and we need to figure out some way of determining is there a change, is there a connection or not. So I think those who have had the courage to reassess activism and reassess our theory of activism have done so on two levels. First, you have to reassess our theory of how change is achieved, and then second, you have to reassess our approach to the question of strategy. Okay. So this is the present moment still. Let's talk about briefly, because we did a whole workshop on it this afternoon, so I'm not going to rehash it because some of the people were there, but let's talk briefly about our theory of change. Okay. So the most simplistic explanation for contemporary activism's theory of change, and this is, I know I'm creating kind of a straw man argument because no one, at least when stated in this way, would actually say they believe this, but some people really do. A lot of people actually do believe this, which is that change happens through human action in the material reality. Therefore, if there's anything that you want to change, you must create a behavior, get large numbers of people to do it, and that's how change happens. Okay, it makes a kind of intuitive sense. It works really well on direct action type things, like if I want to, stop the environmental apocalypse, I just need to block coal trains. That makes kind of sense. It's called voluntarism. But there's actually other possibilities. So most activism emphasizes this capacity for human action, and it's really oriented around getting people to do these actions. And they have this whole complicated schemas for how to get people to do those actions, like the ladder of engagement, relational organizing. Basically, they have this whole theory about that. But there's another option, which is that moments of revolution and social change are actually instigated by structural factors outside of the human will, but still within the material environment. So very briefly, the best example of this is food prices. So there's been some really compelling research done by academics that has shown that food prices are the number one and most significant determiner of whether or not there will be social unrest in the country. And so they have actually quantified. They say that if the UN food price is above 210, that's when social unrest tends to occur. And so actually it's true that during the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street, food prices were above the UN food price index of 210. And when the food price index dropped below 210, lo and behold, the movement dissipated. So the creation of Occupy Wall Street was not me or Adbusters or the people who organized the meetings. It was the global food commodity market, or some would argue it was actually climate change, which induced droughts, which increased the price of sugar, which drove up food prices. And so what we're doing here is basically answering the question, why do protests sometimes happen? Why do protests and movements sometimes take off, sometimes they don't? So the one answer is, the voluntarist human action people say, oh, it's because we didn't get enough people to do that behavior. The structuralists say, oh, it's because the economic situation wasn't right, or other structural factors weren't aligned to get people into the streets. The third option, though, is that it's not about human action at all, it's about human subjectivity. And this is like the spiritual side. This is called subjectivism. And it's saying that, no, what we need to do if we want to change external reality and to change your internal reality. And so we need to engage in meditation practices or spiritual practices. And we got into all these different forms in the workshop pretty deeply, but I would just say that this one has a spectrum. It manifests very broadly. On one side is a kind of strict subjectivism that, for those who are familiar with the Course in Miracles, they want to read that? It's very okay. I find that there's like a secret Course in Miracles. I joke with like bar students, they'd never heard of it because they're like 17, 18-year-olds. And I said to them, yeah, but if you find some people who, even if you're in like a more older community, and you say to them, do they know Course in Miracles? They're never going to know it, and then they're going to invite you to the secret Course in Miracles workshop. that's how that thing is transmitted. That's a really powerful book. Everyone should read that because it'll open your eyes up to a whole different theory of social change. But if you read the Course in Miracles, one of the things that they say is that if you want to literally, nothing outside of our mind exists to a certain degree, and if you want to change the world, just change your own mind. And it has a whole schema for that, that whole workshop. That's a very strict subjectivism that's very solipsistic. But there's also a weaker subjectivism that just says that revolutions tend to occur, social change tends to occur when there's a shift in the mood. You have to have a shift in the mood of society before you can have before you can have a movement take off. And so movements don't take off when there hasn't been this shift, and then they try to explain how to create that shift. And then the fourth option, which is why we are here and why we're talking about mysticism and revolutionary change, which is the title of the talk, and why we're in a church, is that revolution and social change is a process that does not involve humans and does not involve the material world. It is an act of some sort of divine intervention to our world. And this one, when I tell secular activists, they can't handle it. They don't want to handle this possibility. They don't want to even entertain the possibility. And so what I do is I give them two examples, secular examples, to kind of trick them. Because I think these are like, they're secular, but are they really secular? So one example is that, I'll just give you one, because we worked through this workshop, but basically the core idea is that there was this Russian cosmologist in the 20th century, and he studied sunspot activity. So people know about sunspots. The sun has spots of varying number, on a cycle of 11 years, and he found, and the thing about it that's important to know is note that humans have been recording the number of sunspots for like thousands of years because it's something that we can see. So there's lots of actual evidence of I saw this number of sunspots, and it's not exactly. It wasn't until the 1700s, I think, that they quantified exactly how to record the sunspots, but still, we had a general sense of how many sunspots were in certain years. He found that revolutions tend to occur during periods of peak sunspot activity. In other words, if there's lots of sunspots, that tends to correlate with revolutionary moments. It's a very interesting observation. Stalin threw him into the Gulag because it violates materialist conceptions of social change. But what's so fascinating about this was in the early 1900s. And what is absolutely fascinating about this theory is that if you go and you look at the sunspot activity on Occupy, the first day of Occupy Wall Street, there were record high number of sunspots. So this is a secular theurgism. Theurgism is this divine intervention quadrant. I call it secular because it involves the sun, but it's also kind of religious because we all know the sun was one of the primary gods that was worshipped throughout human history. And then, of course, the other fantastic example of theurgism is Christianity itself. I think that not enough time is spent among activists wondering how it is that Christianity became the amazing force that it is with the number of adherents that it has around the world. Was it done through large-scale social protests? No, it was not. How was it achieved? Well, to simplify things a great deal, through the conversion of St. Paul and Constantine. I mean, two people had a dream, they reoriented their lives, and Christianity ultimately became the state religion. Isn't it amazing? I mean, it's like contemporary activists love to complain about how hard they have it. But imagine you were an early Christian. You were the only outlawed belief system. You could be any other belief except for Christianity. That's amazing, first of all. And it was, I believe, the first outlawed belief system. And they would do this. I mean, what's amazing is that the power of the early Christians is amazing because they would say to them, look, all you have to do is sacrifice in front of these other gods. That's all you have to do. Everyone else is doing it. The Jews are doing it. We have imperial cult worship. They're doing it. All the pagans are. And the Christians were like, no. And that was the default. Oh, then you're a Christian. And you get thrown to the lions, and everyone's going to laugh and cheer while you die. And they went from that position to being the state religion and then carrying out the persecution of the pagans. That's amazing. Through dreams, right? So if you read secular interpretations of Constantine's conversion, they always try to say that it didn't happen. Which, to me, it's like, the problem with this logic is that they spend so much time trying to convince you it didn't happen. I'm just like, but you don't do that for any other explanation. For any other thing, you say it didn't happen. So they say, he didn't see the cross in the sky, he didn't have the dream, it's a cynical ploy, all this kind of stuff. And in fact, if you read Engels, Frederick Engels has reflected on the conversion of Constantine. He says, no, what happened is that the soldiers in his army were already Christians, and somehow they are the ones who then, he tries to create a bottom-up theory of Constantine's conversion. I'm just like, what about the most obvious explanation, which is, yeah, he saw Jesus. He saw Jesus. And partly because the early Christians did a tremendous job of, that was part of their theory of social change. They did a tremendous job at priming people to have dreams of Jesus. Is one explanation. I think it's quite interesting. So anyways, those are the four quadrants, and so at the level of a reassessment of theory of change, it's a devaluing, I think that we need to go through a devaluing of the strict voluntarist side of things, and a privileging perhaps of the other sides of things. If only because of out of necessity. Like when we think of activism as kind of like a hard hitting against forces, that is precisely the kind of activism that our government is most prepared to deal with. They have all of the tanks and the military, as we saw in Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, they have all of the crowd control technologies that they need. What they don't, and what they are not equipped to, especially all under the current government, they are completely unequipped to deal with spiritual and subjectivist theories of change. The best they can do, and we'll get into this later, the best they can do is deploy fake news and other ways of, which is a very subjectivist attack, but still, I find that much weaker than the powerful experience of the early Christian church. Okay, so that's a reassessment of theory of change. The other side, though, is we have to reassess our approach to strategy. Like, what is it that we're supposed to be doing as activists? Is probably the most important question, right? Are we supposed to be, influencing our governments? And, what is the strategy that we're trying to do to create change we want? So I think one of the ways of looking at it is to take, for example, I think the best example is the 2003 anti-war march, February 15, 2003. Was anyone in the march? Yeah, I was there. Anyone else? Okay. So to refresh those who were not in the march, February 15, 2003 ended up being about, I'll foreshadow history. It's about, almost about exactly 1 month before the Iraq War started. Okay, so you know the results of the protests already. But 1 month before the Iraq War started, activists around the world carried out the greatest feat in the history of activism we've ever achieved as humans, which is a global, synchronized march around the exact same thing with one clear demand and a clear message, without violence, across demographics, in every country. So I was in New York City, hundreds of thousands, millions of people in various European cities. Like if you Google the imagery, it's amazing. And the thing about it is it goes a long way to defeat a lot of the critiques of the activism. Like the number one critique of activism is, you failed because you didn't have a demand. It's like, okay, 2003, everyone knew what was going on. If you Google London 2003 anti-war protests, you will see thousands and thousands of people just carrying a sign that says no to the war. It could not have been more obvious. It was like the most obvious protest in human history. And it was amazing, and I think it foreshadowed a lot of the eruptions of social protests, of social movements that we see today, like the ability to carry out a synchronized global march this is 2003, so this is like, I guess Google was kind of new, and there were no smartphones. Anyways, it was an early example of the power of network organizing. But what did George Bush say when he saw those protests and came home? He said, I don't base my policies on focus groups. They called the protests focus groups. Tony Blair went along with him, and then they launched into a preemptive strike. So why is this event significant? It's significant because it gets to this question of strategy. I would argue that protest is broken because democracy is in crisis. Okay, so since Rousseau basically codified it, the idea of democracy is that the authority of our governments derives from the consent of the government. And so what we were supposed to be doing as activists, especially the 2003 anti-war march, we were showing them, you do not have our consent. There was no clearer way to show the world, the governments of the world, that the people are uniformly opposed to this war. Therefore, you do not have our consent to do this war. Therefore, you cannot do this war. But George Bush said, no. You are not the will of the people. You are a focus group. I don't even know exactly what that really means, but what's significant about it is it does not matter that you got these people out. It does not represent the will of the people. I will not allow my decisions to be trumped by your show of force. And this, I think, broke something about activism, and it broke something about democracy. I think that it actually would have been better for all of us had he said, okay, fine. Because if the people don't have a route to show their discontent to policy through mass organizing, then I think, puts us on this dangerous road which we are today. So this is where we are. And a lot of activists have not learned the lesson of 2003. Hence, March for Our Lives, the Women's March, climate marches, any sort of synchronized global protest that's designed to show that the majority of people are against something will not work because it does not need to work. They don't have to listen to it. Okay. So this leads us to this question of sovereignty. So if sovereignty manifested through, like in the 19th century, they had this good term for it. In America, they called them the people out of doors. So if you cannot manifest sovereignty as the people out of doors, like people who go into the streets and protest, then that means we have only two options left. We can use protest to win wars, or we can use protest to win elections. So elections and war are the two remaining sources of sovereignty in our world. And we've seen very compelling uses of both. Obviously, again, it's what I believe, but obviously I think I would prefer the elections route because there has not been a case of, basically in the 70s, the left tried the war route and it didn't go well for anyone. Whether underground, red brigades, all that kind of stuff. Urban guerrilla warfare didn't work at all. And in fact, if you look at the FARC in Colombia, all of the groups who pursued the war method have by now renounced it and said it just doesn't work. So that leaves elections. And in elections, we have like the five-star movement in Italy and Podemos in Spain and the Paraguay in Iceland. These are examples of using social protest in elections. Okay, so now we're moving to the future, and then I'll take your questions. So this is where I usually just stop with secular audiences, because ultimately both options are materialist. They can get those. They're like, fine, elections are war. And then I can go and I can talk about what the elections look like, how do social movements win elections, how do we not become involved? There's a whole series of questions. And then war, it's like, well, the only people who want to do that in this world are ISIS, but look at ISIS, they got defeated, so basically we just don't even have to talk about that one, and we move forward. But, privately, I've begun to have some doubts about both strategies for the exact same reason, which is that there's like a spiritual crisis going on. And I think that both strategies are flawed if you don't take into account a deeper spiritual crisis. So for example, one of the things that I think that's going on with the world that we live in is that our minds are being attacked, right? Our conceptions of reality are being attacked by fake news on left and right. Left loves fake news too. Everyone loves fake news. So our conception of reality is being attacked. I think our moral grounds are being attacked. I was just on an airplane. I should tell you this anecdote, which is so disturbing. I was on this airplane from Austria, of all places, and there was this ad for every single TV show on the airplane that was literally, you could not read it except for an encouragement for infidelity, like for business travelers. So it was a beer ad aimed at business travelers, and it's saying, it's like, where is home? Is home where you travel to, where you live? No, home is where you have this brand of beer, and then it shoots this beautiful bartender handing you the beer. And I'm like, this is just an ad for having adultery. This is wrong that you're showing this ad over and over again on the plane. The point here is that I feel like our world, that democracy doesn't function when the populace their minds have been destroyed. And it's possible that we live in a reality where I'm not just saying their minds have been destroyed, I'm saying my mind has been destroyed, your mind, all of our minds have been destroyed. None of us is exempt from a spiritual crisis. We are all destroyed. And that's why I'm starting to wonder, like, maybe democracy can't function anymore under these conditions. I'm like, I don't want to lose hope in democracy, and I haven't lost hope in democracy, but part of me does wonder, is like, maybe the strategy of trying to do elections is fundamentally flawed in this. Maybe we need to fix the technological background to it. Maybe it's that it's the smartphone, maybe it's that it's the connected social media or whatever, but maybe it's possible, we need to entertain the possibility that elections won't work because there's some sort of spirit, that our spirit has been destroyed. But then on the other side, we know that winning wars and fighting wars is also something that destroys our spirit. Committing violence, as many people have pointed out, is something that destroys our self. That's one of the strongest arguments against committing violence as activists, is that who it really hurts is yourself, in addition to the other people. So, if your only options are winning wars and winning elections, but both of those would require some sort of spiritual renewal, but spiritual renewals are not allowed because of secular activism, then we're kind of in a stuck situation, right? And so that's why I want to think about this question of, and this is where I'll kind of end and take questions, but I think the question that I'm thinking about is, okay, so maybe there's a third option. Maybe this third option can derive from religious communities, from the church, to use the famous phrase of Martin Heidegger, who said that only a God can save us. Maybe there's some truth to this, that only a God can save us. And then it becomes a question of, like, what can that mean? And can it mean anything other than just acquiescence and giving in? I was talking to Demond, he was telling me about this concept of social gospel and the tension between, like, saving people, helping people, and saving souls. But it also occurs to me that there has to be a third option, which is that can we save our communities and our government somehow? Like, is this divide between basically, so where activists won't go is into questions of spirituality, and where at least many Christians won't go is into questions of government and taking power. And it's like, maybe we are the ones who, or whatever. So I guess that's where I'm at, is wondering these questions of what could be the role. Is there a third option? Could it come from this? Could it come from spirituality? What would that look like? And now not to succumb to all the dangers that would entail. So thank you very much for listening to that, and happy to take your questions.